9 Khoisan people are heading home after almost 100 years away. Their remains were unethically donated to the University of Cape Town in the 1920s. They became known as the Sutherland 9 after the area where their bodies were found. Now, the remains were donated by a farmer's son and medical student, Karel Coetzee, who what makes it unethical is that Coetzee knew the deceased and they were taken from his farm. Now let's discuss this now with the University's Victoria Gibbons. Victoria, thank you for joining us this afternoon. What an interesting story. I mean, for people who don't know anything about the Sutherland 9, why is their story so important for South Africans?
First of all, thank you for having me on your show, and good afternoon to you and your viewers. So I think what's very interesting about the Sutherland 9 is this is the precedent-setting restitution process in the nation. And we embarked in the process as the university before there was policy or legislation on how to return unethically obtained human remains from universities and museums back to communities. And so we have been embarking on this process for some time. We started in 2018, and one of the things that's very interesting in this process is that the community requested full research analyses on the 9 to understand their stories and how they ended up at the university. And we hope that this year they will be reburied back in Sutherland later this year.
Is there a time frame for when that will happen?
We are awaiting discussions and dialogue with the national government, the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, as well as the Premier's office in the Northern Cape Province to finalize that deadline and a date on that. But we are very hopeful it will be this year.
You mentioned that I can't believe that there is no policy or was no policy in South Africa for restitution or repatriation of human remains. When did that policy come into effect?
It came into effect officially last year. And actually this entire process was integral in shaping that policy. And the policy was passed by the National Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. I think officially it came out in December 2021, but has really only started to be implemented in 2022.
And let's talk about the descendants of these 9 Khoisan people from Sutherland area. Let's talk about their families and or their descendants or families, whatever word we want to use here. But what role did they play, or are they still playing in this whole story?
So when we embarked on this process, honestly, my anticipation was this would be a fairly straightforward return and reburial. However, the descendant families requested that full research analyses, which put them in the lead role in guiding us in a community-driven research process, which was really intertwined in many regards. So it included historical analyses, archaeological analyses, but also knowledge sharing on different cultural practices and spiritual beliefs between different Khoi and San groups with the descendant community in Sutherland. It's much bigger and broader than a research process. And the descendant community has driven the entire process to date.
And this is, it's fascinating. I think, you know, the Sutherland example is definitely a global example as well. I think a lot of global role players can also, you know, take something from this when it comes to restitution and restorative justice, in a sense.
Definitely. This is an example of descendant community driving research, but also taking control over what restitution looks like for them. And that can occur in a variety of ways. And for this community and this descendant family group, understanding the stories of their ancestors And I saw you had some of the images of the reconstructions of the faces of the individuals. Seeing those faces allowed the families to reconnect with their ancestors in ways that they couldn't before. And so these faces embody a lot of the biological research data, but also it just was really a translation of the science into a tangible face of their relative, and they were able to reconnect in ways that they weren't without those faces. And it has been extremely enriching to see how they've embraced this process, but also that when they saw these faces, they felt like they, were part of their families today. They could see themselves in the faces. They could see the faces in their communities even today. And I think this is a really important component of the process of where we give back and restoring connections and reconnections which were taken away during the colonial era.
And interesting enough, I mean, we've seen the faces there, but how old are these bodies and these remains that were found?
Yes, so these people lived in the 19th century. They lived and worked on the Christopher farm in Sutherland, and they passed away as well on the farm and were buried on the farm in the farmer's cemetery. It was around 20 or 50 years later that they were exhumed from their graves by the farmer's son and brought to the university as donations of skeletons that were typical of San and Khoi remains, which speaks to the racial collecting that occurred in South Africa in the early 1900s. So between actually it was the late 1800s, but we as an institution only opened in 1918. So between 1918 and 1931, there was this active collecting of indigenous bodies and human remains around the country for a global trade network.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor Victoria Gibbon from the University of Cape Town, just giving us a brief little update there about the Sutherland 9. Their bodies will be taken back home to Sutherland, where they will be returned to, and their families, of course, also playing a huge role, their descendants, in this whole process. Very, very interesting.